Hi all, thanks very much. I have to tell you, this is absolutely a blast. And what I'm remembering is the 2 decades plus longish delta of having worked in cybersecurity in my first cybersecurity conference, and I think there might have been 4 women in an audience of 200, and you knew who was in cyber. You'd say the brunette long hair, at that time it wasn't silver, it really was brunette. That was Deb, redhead, that was Cynthia, and that's how we knew one another. We could never have fielded something like this for, I would say, probably 15 years into my career, so this is amazing. It's really wonderful watching it emerge. Also, as mentioned, I decided to make a little tweak in my talk, so you'll see me skim past a couple of slides. I'm hoping we're going to get approval to leave them as leave behinds. And that's because I'm getting so many questions, even more than usual, about the agency, about what we do, about data science, about who knows what all. And so I thought it'd be more interesting than mine trying to guess what's most important to you, to give you some things that I think is very important to share with the community, and then let you ask me what you'd like. So thank you locally and globally for that, and it is going to be a little bit dyslexic as I slip through some of these slides. So, in the interest of not spending too much slide on my dwell slide, this is the one that says government cares about data science, check. I shouldn't, I'll say just a teeny bit about that. Not everyone who cares about data science understands what it is or how to use it. And that's something that was brought home in the last session we had on data ethics and governance, when we talked about how people use and sometimes misuse data or didn't understand what the unintended consequences are. So as a global citizenry, as those that understand the technology, it's up to us to help educate. But that's all I'm going to say about that slide. Because this one, I think, is a little more interesting to some of you. How many of you have maybe heard of the National Security Agency? The no such agency that nobody knows. You all know about it now. You ever met a chatty NSAer before? All right, now you've got one. So part of what I've taken on as my role as the director of research at the agency, I came in from the outside not quite 6 years ago, so I'm maybe a touch different than the average NSAer that you would meet. But part of my role as the research director, and dual-hatted now as the science advisor, as our NSA science advisor in our last reorg, and also innovation champion, and who knows what all else, is to help with that transparency barrier, because in all seriousness, it is very difficult for people outside the intelligence community to understand what it is we do. There are 16 intelligence agencies. Understanding what any particular one of those does is tough. And every country in the globe, and we represent so many of them here and then on Twitter and outside with the other WIDs, they all treat their intelligence gathering a little bit differently. Just about every place I know has got some approach to it, but they can be very different. And so giving you a sense of what we do in the US will help you give you a context for me and where I'm coming from with some of these challenges. This is an area you are welcome to ask me about also in the questions if you like. But for now, let me talk about our 3 high-level missions. You can think of these as the things that generate the data that I care the most about, and we talk about these challenges. And so one of them is our information assurance mission. That's the responsibility that we have to support the Department of Defense and the rest of the United States when it's deemed critical to national security under XYZ sets of regulations and calls, so DoD primary and some of the others next, in defending their systems. It doesn't mean we get on those systems directly, we don't own them, but we're required to support. So we have a defense mission there, and that's probably, if you've met an NSAer before who was out and about, you might have gone to a cybersecurity conference if you'd gone to our data science and met someone from that field. We also have a foreign intelligence mission. Now this is the one that makes people the most uncomfortable, unless it's the network warfare, network operations side of things. So I'll put this one out on the table, especially with respect to the place that the NSA holds here. Foreign intelligence has to do with gathering information outside of our boundaries, outside of our citizenry, that feeds questions that those that are policymakers and military leaders and another group of customers within the federal government, the US federal government, have. So this is not a place where lots of us sit around a table in a smoke-filled room and decide here's the 20 things we'd like to know about the world that we're worried about. Well, we will give input as to what we think is important for the nation to understand, to make important policy decisions, which could be anything from movement of troops to diplomatic missions. This is the sort of thing that comes to us from the outside. So you might think of the Oval Officer as being one of our customers or partners there. Congress will have questions for us. We will get questions from military leaders, as I say. So they're gathering foreign intelligence, treating that information, and analyzing that to come come up with answers to those questions that they formulate is part of what we do. There are also some ongoing questions that they have, so you could think of that as like the bread and butter, things that we need to monitor all of the time. There's a new mission that's evolved. This one is harder to state. You'll see different slides out of NSA calling it different names because we're evolving our understanding of where the lines are with ourselves and the US Cyber Command. How did US Cyber Command get involved in here? Well, the boss of the NSA, the director of NSA, Dernsa, is actually also dual-hatted as a military commander for the United States Cyber Command, which has responsibility for defending the cyber boundaries, which I would take the whole rest of the day to go ahead and explain what that means. But the same person who runs us runs that organization, and so that has a tighter relationship. So we not only deal with some of the cyber defense that we talked about in the IA, not only those cyber methods that we need in order to gather the foreign intelligence, but there is a support to the command that's a little bit different. So we talk about C&E, cyber network exploitation, C&D, cyber network defense, and CNO, cyber network operations. And that's probably more than you wanted to know, or you'll ask me more questions at the break. But those you can think of as the 3 data sets. I've also implied a customer set for our data. So we have people that are not intelligence officers all the time, but sometimes are, who will ask us questions which might be very broad or might be very nuanced. They might be very sensitive. And we'll talk a little bit about the data. Other people have asked me a bit about what in the world is a research organization doing in a place like that. And that is because if you are trying to deliver an advantage over an adversary, whoever they are, you really need to be on the cutting edge of your game in certain kinds of technology. So there are things that we do in research that help with the effectiveness and efficiency. There are things we use in order to get ahead of what we call the threat to the organization. And my apologies to our foreign visitors here. There just are differences of opinion between nations. And frankly, we all know that the relationships between countries can change in a heartbeat. And so, unfortunately, while I am a very peaceable, optimistic person, it is sometimes necessary to keep that in mind. So that's part of the job, part of what we do. We're structured, if you looked at us, a little bit like if you took a look at a campus and kind of shrunk most of the S&T in one place. So we have a group focused on math, crypto math. You sometimes hear us called the code makers and code breakers. We have a data analytics group that comes by different names, that does more than just data, does a lot of different kinds of analysis. We have physical sciences, which are important, and we have telecommunications, that's really important. We used to have a thing that we invested in that dealt with pedagogy for language, which unfortunately we weren't able to continue to maintain. That's been rolled up in part of one of our other groups, and a number of other different things. So if you looked inside my tent, you would see people that looked very much like researchers, except A, they very rarely write papers, they almost never write proposals, and most of their work is highly classified. So it is a touch different from that standpoint, but other than that, they would fit well in most academic departments. They're very free-thinking, and they're very creative people, and they work very hard. Now, my next slide gets at one of the things that really is different about how research operates in NSA from any other organization that I've seen, and that includes the ones that work in tight classified environments, whether they're in other nations or in ours. And that's something I've dubbed mission-oriented research internally, and the name has caught on. You know, we're used to talking about basic research, where you think of some basic change that maybe needs to be examined for quite a while, something fundamental. You hear people talk about applied research, where you think about somebody's got an end in mind and that drives things, so maybe it's not quite so basic. Mission-oriented research is research that is intended to achieve one of our mission goals in some way, but the time scale doesn't matter. But it all has to eventually support the mission of the agency. So we could literally have a 20-year plan that might have hugely basic findings that need to be uncovered in terms of math, physical sciences, analytics, that we would be pursuing, and then eventually knit those together. Sometimes we take that and we need to transition it to the outside. That happens very often in our information assurance mission, because if you're trying to defend large-scale computer networks, you don't want NSA having to churn out all the widgets that are used to do that. It's much more effective to come up with a protocol, to share it, let others implement it, and then sell it or buy it how they like. So that's basically how we operate. When you think about the target then, I've told you a bit about the customer for who uses our data. I'd like you to think about our analysts somewhat simplistically as living in a room like this. That's That's sort of wrong. That actually is a picture of one of our operations centers, but it's nice to have a picture in your head of something a bit more concrete. So think of that as a place where people from different perspectives, maybe from an offense and a defense perspective, can sit together and talk about what they're seeing on a network, whether something is a danger or not, whether something needs to be monitored or not, whether there's a hot spot in the world or not. So they're able to analyze data. Some of them are on a faster pace, so they're trying to deal with a world event that takes place in the matter of like that. Some of them are on a more slow pace where they're looking at things emerge over a course of years. So there's a consolidation and a time frame that's different. Research produces a lot of the prototypes that are eventually turned by now called the capabilities organization or others, as I say, if we're working with industry, into the pieces that are used there. And they also buy a lot from the outside. So think about that as mission-oriented research. I'm including this slide because my graphics team works really hard and they wanted me to show you a picture of me climbing on a rock. So that actually is me. You saw a sailboat picture before. That's from Sardinia last year. I am a very enthusiastic rock climber. I took it up 2 years ago when my mentor said I told him I couldn't get my mind off my work by hiking. He said, try rock climbing. I said I was scared to death of heights. And he said fear of death would help me focus. Now you know what my life is like. So my vacation is to go to places and climb really high and sometimes fall off. I have a rope. But it still gets a little scary. But I kind of like that picture anyway in terms of thinking through mountains of data, because there's a similarity between what a rock climber goes through when they're trying to assess the territory and what we go through when we're dealing with data. That big rock that looks so strong, that is crumbly. All right, so we're dealing with data, especially in our business, but many of you in yours, and I know some of the previous speakers had this problem, that is messy. We all think our data is the messiest in the world. Mine maybe is. I don't know. But we all think of it as messy. Ours is particularly messy because it's taken generally from those who don't want us to have it, frankly. Right? It is not in the interest of what I'm loosely dubbing the adversary to speak clearly in English in nice statements into, say, a mic, and then hand us that, and if we can't quite understand it, send us another version so we can disambiguate. Doesn't happen like that, right? They're just as bad as we are, so if you take all the red tape speak you've ever heard in government and then you add people intentionally making that difficult, you get a sense. And then you think through, you've got different languages going on, you think that you might have only pieces, and there's a thing I'm going to talk about later that is actually of deep concern to me, not just for ourselves, but for many of you, is that there are attempts, of course, to mislead us, and so the data we get is not necessarily accurate, and it's very likely to be somebody extremely smart, savvy, and possibly with as much power as our nation who is trying to change that data to make us not understand what we're seeing, right? So we'll talk a bit more about that. So in some sense, that what's hard about rock climbing is what's hard about data science, because you don't quite know what you've got until you pull on it and it holds. And if it falls off, you fall. As I know, 15 feet is no fun, even with a rope. Next step, this again, I'm not going to spend much time on this. It was my dwell slide, and it was intended to tell you a little bit about our value proposition for investing in analytics, and to give you a sense of where we expect to be fielding certain kinds of technologies. This is not a national secret. We've talked about this sort of thing before, but right now you think more, and I'm not talking about media in terms of the news media. I'm talking about physical media here, by the way, in case anybody was wondering. So I'm looking at what kinds of things one might analyze directly. That was more like a 2007 capacity. Now it's all about fusion analytics. So how do you put together your video, your voice, sensor data if you're dealing with nuclear kinds of things, vibrations, things of that nature. How do you work that out? That's more like a 2017-ish delivery and use, so we're looking at effectiveness and efficiency. And then we're moving on, thinking another decade down the road to something we keep changing the name of because the discipline keeps changing the name of, but predictive analytics is close enough. You'll hear me talk about anticipatory analytics as well. Think of predictive as something that's more quantitative, something as anticipatory as more qualitative for purposes of this talk. There's a lot of argument about what the words are right, and I don't really much care as long as you understand what I mean. So you can change those to me to match what you're used to. So now I'm going to talk about some of the challenges, and you will have time to ask me questions about the front end if you want, but I wanted to hit some of the particular challenges that I'm seeing both within the agency and within government across defense and the IC in terms of how we do our business. it's very clear that the desires and the wishes of the US population and the world is culturally changing with respect to what data they'd like gathered and how they'd like that managed. I think that's fair to say. And given that, it's important and behooves us, as well as all of you, by the way, to think about the methodologies we use in order to analyze that data, store that data, and do search, because those things have a tremendous impact on such properties as, say, privacy, civil liberties, and how you include or exclude data. So we start with something simple called the classification model internally, where we give people things on the basis of a need to know. To tell you how that gets a bit more complex, that's divided up into, for our agency, and others are even different, you've got your secret, your top secret, and then your top secret compartmented, and then inside of the compartments you have different labels, which you could call either tickets or you could call them compartments based on how sensitive a piece is. And so if I, as an analyst, want to gain access to an information, I have to have a declared need to know that. There's some reason why I should have access to that, and I should be able to capture that. It shouldn't just be, well, I need to know something about, say, Deb and her rock climbing. I should know, I need to really understand what Deb was doing in Sardinia on that particular wall, so that's my need to know, and I might check that off. And those things will be different for each analyst in the list. And so the data that they might get to answer a query will differ based on the classification. So that's what we already have. That's not simple, because somebody's got to label that data and got to manage it in the system. And by the way, it is a little more complicated in terms of legal access to it. So FISA court, ring a bell. If it's FISA data, it needs to be handled differently, and you have to have different tickets. So all of that needs to be captured in the labels so that systems like this that go and pull out information for the analyst do it correctly. So that's very nice. That's actually not an argument right now. That's just how we do the normal business. The interesting thing that I'm seeing in terms of the argument or discussion has to do with how one does something called discovery. So in classical discovery, so when I'm at home and trying to figure out where this conference is or what I might want to do or where my next rock is, I would ask a query, I'd go out to the search engines, they'd all come back with lots of information, I'd pick the piece that I want. Okay, so that sounds great, that's discovery. That's a nice way for an analyst to operate. In our world, they'd go out, everything that they had the right to access and the need to know could be brought back and then analyzed. Think about the implications, though, from a privacy standpoint, or just do you want everybody to see every piece of data? They're now getting all of the possible data. They don't need all of that. So an alternative that's being discussed is, could we change search so you only get a smaller slice and still perform discovery? So could you do targeted pieces, targeted pieces, targeted pieces? That's a lot harder. And the reason that's important is that we are now coming up to not an ethical question so much, but how could we achieve a goal and still attain the level of effectiveness and efficiency in terms of analyst time? So the search technique, oddly enough, that's used, even more so than the data labeling or any of the rules, has a lot to do with whether or not we can implement certain policies and whether we can achieve certain results in a certain length of time. So that is a nice way to frame the discussion, because it takes the emotion out of it and lets us think through what it is we most want. And that can then map to what in one nation might have one new rule, or if it's a corporation trying to do this, they might think through this sort of thing as well. I could spend a lot of time on that slide too, but I won't. Anticipatory intelligence, I want to mention this because I did say this is one of our next big things. This and predictive, whether qualitative or quantitative, are massively more difficult than simply understanding what has happened, as tough as that is, because you're taking what you know about the world in the past and projecting that into the future. And you just heard me talk about how lossy that data is. So the ability to project forward is really nice, because if you can get a jump on a hot spot in the world by using data that will give you some information saying there's going to be a problem, somebody's going to be attacked, you might be able to intervene. Of course, there's a flip side to that too. But how solid is your information? At this stage, you're projecting forward. So people go back and forth on the relative merits of whether one should deliver a predictive or anticipatory analyst to a policymaker, or the one should stick with analyzing what we currently know about the world. But the fact is people want this. And so this is a thing we need to think about as data scientists, ways to understand the error bars around decisions and projections of this type, and ways to explain that, even more importantly, to those who will use it, so they'll be able to make the good decisions we're trying to get to. So that's important. This is a use case. I will not tell you how much work it was to get that use case out, even as high level as this is. So that's a thing for you. Future states, I won't go into this because I'm down to 5 minutes, and there's something else I wanted to talk about is another piece of this. Anticipatory thinking for smart cities is another way to get at the same sort of problem. This is planning, so you might think about how do you plan ahead using anticipatory thinking. In some ways this is nicer because you can morph it. In other ways it's worse because if you guess wrong, you might spend a lot of money in a bad way. And we won't talk about that one or that one. See, I got a chance to give a techie slide for once, and so there you go. This one I want to foot stop. In fact, if I save 5 minutes here on this one, I will be content, because this is a big problem. This came up a bit in the data governance discussion we just had. And so I'm here not to bring you solutions, I'm here to bring you problems. In this sense, adversarial machine learning. Machine learning is a wonderful tool. It's great. We have troubles with it even when we use it with people who don't understand. But in my world, and increasingly beyond my world, the capacity to influence, to use a big data attack on big data, or to get specific.
I'm hosting with
or to get specific in terms of understanding a machine learning algorithm, or to guess really well about a PageRank algorithm, can be used to drive analysts of all kinds into making bad decisions. That is really a problem in my domain. I'll give you one nice specific one, a very lovely approach. Cyber moving targets, or self-healing systems, or dynamically self-defending systems that automatically adapt and defend themselves from adversaries, is a great approach. It gets us out of the whack-a-mole, catch-and-patch, human-oriented activity. This is particularly vulnerable to a savvy adversary knowing what kind of machine learning tool I'm using to understand their behavior. And a really savvy adversary is going to be able to infiltrate my system, and their behavior is going to look normal. So I could actually get, in a sense, where I am required by my machine learning algorithm, by the results of that, to defend their right to stay in my network, even though they're insider threat. And that's a hard thing to swallow. So somebody was talking about, when do you use a rule-based system? That may be a case where you set some absolute rules for what you look at. But this is the type of thing that is clearly going to be a problem sort of now, because this is when we're seeing these systems being fielded. This bigger level picture is what's coming up, and so I would urge you, as you think through your data structuring, your data courses now, how do you help your students, how you as students and you as employees elsewhere understand this whole adversarial aspect as well. A thing that I said in our last session over lunch is how much this aspect and some of the ethics conversations remind me of the early days of cybersecurity. We talked about designing security into the network. We just talked about making it easy to pull building blocks so it would be just secure from the beginning, that people would not have to manipulate that directly, and how much better the world would be. We missed our Pearl Harbor in '88. That was the Morris worm attack that took down 10% of the internet. I think that data sciences are at a similar point in terms of many of us understand that there's a problem here, but there's so much good going on that we don't all have time to step back and think about the dark underbelly. So I would urge you, plead with you, if I may, to think about these issues as you go forward as part of designing that next generation of data sciences and every good thing it can entail, so that we don't wind up in an analytic comparison to where we are with cybersecurity today. All right? So sorry to be a downer. So I'll quickly move to my dwell slide, and then I think I'm down to my 2 minutes. So look at this, I'm actually making it, plug for language. Okay, our problem with language is, again, the adversary doesn't want to keep on repeating things. Did you know there's 7,000 plus languages in the world? At any given time, we need to care about something like 100 of them. Think about that. That's really interesting kinds of work. We could spend an hour just on that. In fact, we would have if I'd shown all these slides. Visualization, again, we had a great talk on visualization. The only thing I would have added to that talk in terms of something a little different would be to worry about anchor bias. I worry very much about the non-expert consumer of data analytics. which gets back to my opening statement, not really understanding what they're given. And so if they see a picture, they tend to believe it. You know how we all believe that the maps we see of the world, the traditional ones, say how big the United States is? Not true. Go look at a globe and do another comparison, get a different perspective. So we can unfortunately mislead with pictures, and that's something that our community has to be careful about. This one, it looks like I'm able to sneak in my last 44 or 45 seconds, another plug and another request. We invest and look at things like how can we deal with civil liberties and privacy with respect to our data, both because of the regulatory environment and also in my shop because we're thinking through what is it that the US is going to need from us next. And researchers' job is to be there with a solution when the problem arises. We like to get there first and then make that available. But folks, how many of you will accept a privacy solution generated by me at the NSA? All right? Just think about that. I would be very happy to take one from you. My people can take a look at it and vet it. You would perhaps be a little less happy if I proposed and said, trust me, I'm Deb, right? So my suggestion is that in this case, that just as we don't ask pharmaceutical companies to make certain kinds of investments and rely solely on those, it would be very useful if we had mechanisms, building blocks that we could leverage that came to us from outside the agency. Then they could have their tires kicked on them by the broader community. I can take a look to make sure they don't have any gotchas. We're all happy. Okay, so there we are. I think we'll stop with that, and I will take questions. Look, I actually ended exactly on time.
What sort of technologies or research areas, if you can say, are areas where you think you're ahead of the pack that sort of entice us with some interesting areas that you're working on?
It would be very difficult for me to believe people are that much ahead of us in terms of our highest end cybersecurity work. So when we look at the more garden variety, I would say Silicon Valley. I don't mean it that way. I mean the sort of thing that your average industry organization needs to deal with. Silicon Valley's got that by and large. It's really good if you install the tech. But when it comes to nation state kinds of warfare that requires well-trained and handoffs, that's probably something where we'd be at the top. I would say at the moment that in certain areas of analytic dealing with very messy, language-intensive data, we're at the forefront, but not all areas of data analytics. So that's an area people could come and make a difference. But that language, mainly because we have so much data that's related to really extremely messy, hard to deal with problems. Crypto math, I put my crypties up against anybody. I'm sorry. But they're great. They are really fantastic, and they've been at this for a long time. None of these areas can one be complacent in, but those I would say would be our three standouts, and if I had to rate them, that mathematics edge would be right up there at the top.
Over here.
Hey Deborah, great presentation. So I think we all are technology geeks and we understand science. So we kind of value all that predictive analysis and the big data and all the information overload brings. But then when I speak to the common man who probably don't understand, so they have a lot of fear that, like as if you're going to predict my next move, what drink I'm going to select, to what extent, where do you draw the thin line? Yeah. So what are your thoughts about it, and how do you think we as scientists should, address that when talking to, other people?
Yeah, that is a really hard question. Every time I talk to a new person, when it's me as the researcher, and I know our analysts do the same thing when they're delivering, they need to assess what that person's understanding is of a predictive model especially. You find it with analysis too. You can tell people the confidence interval is what the confidence interval is, and they're going to see, oh, we said that the A is in country B. So what I think a best practice is, and this I'd love to see assessed from the academic community, frankly, because we know it mostly by practicing it. I think what I've seen work most effectively is to deliver the information and then have a follow-up intervention to see if you can elicit what they understood about that by probing with questions afterwards, and then make sure that they know how to use it. So rather than deliver and then let go and say you're done at that point, what is that ongoing responsibility from ourselves particularly, but also some of the rest of you as data scientists delivering solutions to make sure that the recipient understands it. We don't hand over pills without having that kind of conversation. To me, some of the kinds of analysis we do, particularly in my world, is in that same level of importance, making sure people understand what they've got. I hope that.
Over here.
I've been standing a while. So I wanted to go back to your comment about, with pharmaceutical industries, for that example that you brought up, and they go and do their thing, and we trust that they're doing the right thing. But that's because there is a protocol, and then the FDA is the champion of that protocol. And we know I can go online and see the protocol. I might not see all the data for the clinical trial, but I know a protocol was followed and it's regulated.
Exactly.
I would love to see something like that for the work done at the NSA. I don't need to know all your projects, but is there a place that we can all look at the protocol and feel proud of it and trust it?
And see, that's what I would like to see evolve. Whether or not we're the ones that evolve the protocol is the biggest question in my mind. So there are protocols with things like the FISA courts. Some people like those protocols, some people do not. If we're the ones that propose it, and frankly, when I've seen them propose, generally what happens, say, well, that's NSA proposing it, it's probably got a backdoor in it or some such thing. So to guard against that, if those on the outside who are witting and understand the discipline could suggest ways that would be comfortable to the community, and then those things could be codified into law in conjunction with our folks, so we don't wind up in these odd situations where something's in law that's just not going to work to get the result. That's more of a win-win and a mutual elicitation. I see some movement in that direction. I think our hiring of a civil liberties and privacy lawyer to work with those on the outside and some of those issues is great. The public dialogue's been great about FISA, but what happens next in terms of that protocol and how much of that can be shared, just even in terms of knowing how often cases are reviewed. I bet some of you are either pleased or appalled by what you've heard today, and this is more, so that's my attempt to help with the transparency, but there's more that could be done, and I agree with you. So thank you for raising that. It is the big difference between ourselves and Big Pharma.
Sandra.
Hi, Deb.
Hello.
Great talk. I'm Sandra from SAP. Super excited to be here. Amazing talks all day. But yeah, I noticed that you skipped over a slide that had a data visualization where it looked like Facebook was your main source of data.
If you want, we could go back to that one. That actually was a little different one. Yeah, no.
Social media user, I got a little scared. But
Oh, is it this one that's up here? So I'm looking at it right now. That slide, in case some of you saw that and thought, oh no, that's NSA grabbing it. That's actually a picture of when you did a word cloud of who had privacy mentioned next to their name, who popped up as big. So that's actually a good thing that you got named there. See the big slide? It's 26.
What is your main source of gathering data? Can you?
So that gets tricky.
Examples of channels.
Let me see if I can answer this. It doesn't help if I say the world, does it? Is there a simple one I can give you that would make any sense?
We know some Twitter feeds that are increasingly important.
So the easy ones are the FISA data because you asked for a court warrant, but that's not really a main thing. So I will be very vague here. I'm going to go just as far as I can go before I hit a wall, because seriously, we are right up next to one for me. A regulatory, and the wall is where the grave harm to the nation comes. I'm very aware we're global right now also. But when we talk about cyber network exploitation, we're talking about obtaining things in a cyber way. That turns out to be highly effective. So there you go.
We have a question through Twitter. Sergio.
We have a question from one of the WEED's regional events. What approach can we use to get rid of adversarial attacks on machine learning algorithms?
So in fact, I don't think there's going to be any single answer because there's so many. So my suggestion to the community is that we begin capturing those that we know about. Such things that I see looking at false news story identification, that's really important. Some of the ones that I mentioned had to do with identifying covert infiltration of a network defense system. So that'd be a case where you have a powerful adversary who's able to gain access to a system and add in data. So the corresponding for any kind of data is who's got access to it and would be able to infuse over a course of time into whatever feed you're picking up the data from. So we could use some of the cyber taxonomies for attacks and apply that in the big data realm and see how many of those apply to malicious use of a big data, and then you start to think about which defenses would work, because we do often have that for the different taxonomies. So that would be my suggestion for where to start. Think through what happened in cyber, because we've done a lot of work there in terms of figuring out who's got what capacity to make an attack, what kind of access do they need, and then you start to think about which mitigations are effective. Good question.
Next question.
Sorry, I'm trying to see you under the lights. I'm too tall. I'm not exactly the light.
Okay, now it's to them. This is just hypothetical because all this stuff brought a memory of a book that I read a year ago or so. And in the book, the fictional story, right, was that there was some people that were talking about the underbelly thing. Some people that use kind of machine learning to kind of use in Facebook or social media to kind of learn how to impersonate a real person and friend people, but this was actually algorithms and robots and code. And they would impersonate people on Facebook, because these days, so many people that are friends on Facebook, they don't never see themselves in person to person, in real life. And then the objective of all this, the grand scheme, was to kind of friend a lot of people and then slowly kind of influence them into their voting decisions, because they wanted to sway the vote towards some guy, whatever. This is fictional, okay? So my question is, like, have you ever kind of imagined this scenario? How would you attack something like this, or what is your strategy for this kind of thing that seems so subtle, so hard to detect, etc.?
So shifting it into an area where I can actually answer the question instead of that, even though it's fictional, it's a little, So I'm going to talk. I'm going to talk about cybersecurity again, because we've in fact got worked examples. There's a thing often called whaling, which is that next step up from phishing, which involves finding out as much as you can about your target. So take someone like myself. I work at an organization that is of interest to places that might be willing to put in some resources. I'm a fairly open person, having lived my life mostly on the outside, so you can find out everything from the fact I used to ride horses to now rock climbing, and you even know a few places that I've gone. So you also know I regularly attend conferences, and you can tell which ones I like to speak at because you could Google for my name. So you can start building up that story about who is Deb Frincke. And so how would you attack a Deb Frincke? Well, you might send her a note that looks like it's coming from someone who's inviting me to come speak at a great good talk on diversity and wants to have an exchange of ideas. So that's the level of sophistication that you can expect that does happen every day in terms of cyber attacks. It's very regularized. In fact, you can be data-driven to put together your scenarios, and then for people of high interest, you can go even further and manipulate it. So very possible for that to happen in terms of attack on individuals and influencing their behavior. That's been observed too. That's one of the difficult things about working in my business, unfortunately, is you see that really seedy underside. But sadly, while I won't talk about the particular story, putting it in the cyber context of using precise knowledge to pretend to be a different person than one is and have a dialogue in order to influence behavior has been done and has been a regular part, unfortunately, of the cyber arsenal for quite some time. So it's not making things up by any stretch. I think the difference is scale and how many and how easily it can be produced in the era of big data. It's certainly a lot more readily available than it used to be when it was primarily a nation state capacity.
Hey, we have a question right here.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak to us. I kind of have a follow-on that was inspired by something you just said. So I'm aware of interacting with people on social media or things like that in order to influence them to radicalize or other things like that. Do you engage in ethical conversations about taking on personas to encourage the opposite? So taking on a non-radical position to sway somebody off the edge.
Now there are people that do, that would not be our agency, so we are more gathering, more technical side, but if you looked at our sister agency, CIA, that would be a conversation they would have. If you're wondering, the intelligence community people do have conversation about the ethics, pro and con, of where the line should be drawn, and also the legalities of things. And as you know, even from our conversation earlier this afternoon, people draw the line in different places, but that's certainly a thing one can think about. You see that, in fact, in the research community, and so this is a little bit of a plug. So not to be rude about it, but when I talk to my cybersecurity brethren in academia, I'm really not that comfortable with some of the practices that are used in order to elicit behavior that might be managed or moderated. I'm not at all comfortable with some of the data handling technologies. I know people say it's busy and they don't have time to look at every little database, but I look and I have a 5-minute conversation at minimum with the person who owns anything sensitive, every data set we've got, and we've got a lot. So I have a minimum requirement of that. It can take longer, 15 minutes to half an hour, if it takes that long to explain to me, how are we managing the data? When do we take it offline? How are we using it? Is this correct? Is this legal? Who's managing it? What if there's a problem? If I can find time in my day, so help me out with that if you can. Teach your students better.
Thank you, Deb.
I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. You guys enjoyed it. Thank you.